Hi, everybody. Dan O'Many here. I'm the managing director of Inkhouse West. Really, really excited to be here. We've got a panel today to talk about how to think about communications and PR for an early stage startup. And with me are two founders and CEOs who I love working with. Iman Abuzaid from Incredible Health. She's the CEO and co-founder. And Pukar Hamel, the CEO and founder of SecurityPal. Thank you both for taking the time to be here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we're gonna go through a handful of pre-written questions, and once we get through those, if anybody wants to submit questions, they can via Zoom. And if they are having any trouble, just shoot them to me by email. I'm just dan@inkhouse.com, whatever works best. And when we get through the pre-written questions, we'll get through as many of the other questions as we can. Cool. So just to dive in, I want to point this question to you, Aman, because I know in your previous life you were a product executive at a med tech company. So before starting your company, had you done much work in communications or PR, or was this brand new to you when you launched Incredible Health?
So most of it was brand new to me. I think what the only involvement I had in PR before was as a product manager. I was just reviewing one of the reviewers of the press release. Like that's it.
How about yourself, Pukar?
No prior experience in comms. I guess at like our former company, we announced our Series A at one point, and there was some activities related to that, but I hadn't really thought much about it. Yeah.
So both of you, when you started, you were essentially brand new to the concept. Okay, that's helpful because I think most founders are in your boat there. Um, what was the original impetus to build out a comms function? I want to point that one to you first, Aman. Like, what was the original goal or driver behind starting, to build up comms and hire a firm?
It starts with the belief I have in comms and the importance of it. Um, I have this sort of framework of there's doing and there's showing, right? So the we were doing a lot of doing, right? Creating product, closing deals, delivering services and experiences to customers and so on, right? There was a lot of doing. But for the first 2 years of the company, we weren't doing a whole lot of showing, right? We weren't sharing that message more broadly um, outside of the company. And that was intentional to not do the showing for the first 2 years because we didn't have anything. Like we needed to get to product market fit and so on, right? But then it got to a point where it was time to start showing. I do like have a belief that showing is just as important as doing, and in some cases even more important than doing. Um, if you look at just some of the history of some of the just in our space, just in tech, right? Airbnb is an example that has they've been doing PR and comms since their Series A, and for their first 10 years of that company's existence, Booking.com had a lot more revenue than Airbnb, but everyone perceived Airbnb as the market leader. The same thing with Square. Even till today, I mean, they're a public company, and there's still other public companies that drive more revenue in their space, like the payment space, than Square does. But we all perceive Square, whatever their new name is, as the market leader, and that's because they invested in comms and PR since their seed or Series A. So um, showing in a lot of cases can be as important as doing.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, it sort of feels like that, helps with, whether you're trying to hire someone or whether you're trying to raise money or whether you're trying to win a customer, if they're seeing you out there, it gets you a certain distance with them already, right? Unless you're trying to explain from the ground up. Yeah.
Yeah, there was like I remember a chart that one of my investors shared with me. It's called the Lux surface area, and there's two axes on it. It's doing and showing. And if you're moving on both axes, you maximize your Lux surface area, right? So like the number of opportunities that come to you, the team members that want to join your team, the customers that want to join you, et cetera. Like it all expands if you're maximizing both doing and showing.
Mm-hmm. Pukar, what do you think? You agree with that? Is that a similar kind of philosophy as why you started doing comms at SecurityPal?
Well, I started doing it because of my mom. She turned me on it, and I just saw the incredible success of Incredible Health. No pun intended there, but And um, I think there's like differentiation today matters more than ever, I think, as so many products and services and offerings are getting rapidly commoditized. And I think narrative can be one of those things that's a unique differentiator for a company if you can find the right way to tell your story, and find the right sort of like angle to deploy to like amplify it. I think it could be a massive asset. People can copy your features, people can copy, a bunch of things, but your story and your sort of like why you're doing it. I think back to sort of like, Iman's story of how she founded Incredible Health, or how I ended up starting Security Pal. I see Richard there as well. I feel like the why matters so much as business leaders are trying to make decisions and trying to see what differentiates different products and solutions in the market. And if you can really use comms as that sort of like engine to differentiate, I think it matters a lot. I also think strategically, it's sort of another sort of like vector that your competitors and other people have to then fight you on, and so could also stretch resources thin. And if you can find a way to effectively do it, and if you enjoy doing it, that can also be like a massive asset.
That's great. Thanks, Pukar. Hey, Richard. Sorry about that. The technical difficulties
No,
on
no,
our side. We
no,
were,
no.
by the way, everybody, this is Richard Robinson, CEO and founder of Robin AI. And Richard, we were just asking Iman and Pukar, what was the original reason to start doing communications at their startups? So maybe we could start there for you, talk about, what led you to ramp up PR and communications at Robin.
Sure. I'll say a word of introduction because I think it's relevant to the question. So we're an AI legal assistant, and we help companies to accelerate the time it takes to handle contract tasks. So it includes negotiating documents, reviewing documents, finding information inside your contracts. And I think for a long time, we thought communications wasn't going to be a great vector of growth for us because, and I think this is true for lots of startups, essentially, communications is largely branding. It's the kind of work that puts you in the mind of your audience or some kind of audience. And that's useful, but it just produces a slightly lower return on investment, in my experience, than more direct forms of demand generation. But once ChatGPT was released and the interest in AI went through the roof, I think there was a huge shift. And in particular for us, and I don't know if this maps to other people's experience, but what we noticed is we started getting website traffic for our name. People came looking for Robin AI, and people were suddenly looking for AI tools. And in that world, they didn't know anybody. And so suddenly the premium for being the company that's associated with AI just dramatically increased. And so we want people, when they think about legal AI, to think about us. And that means communication and PR suddenly became arguably the most important thing we were doing. And so that was really the impetus for us to start making meaningful investment in PR and comms.
So there was like kind of a upswell in interest and demand for what you were doing that was sort of new, and you kind of were thinking if you didn't take advantage of it or maximize it, others would take more advantage, or you kind of get left
Exactly.
behind. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's one of the primary reasons we hear, yeah, from founders is like all of a sudden their space kind of explodes and they're like, well, hold on, we've been doing this behind the scenes. We need to get a little more credit than we're getting and for the
Absolutely.
work we're already doing. Richard, actually, I'll turn this one to you.
Sure.
But I want everyone's opinion. So how did you start? Like, how did you evaluate, what to do first when it comes to communications? Like, did you talk to your board? Did you have someone on your marketing team that had comms experience? Like, where would a founder start to kind of think about how to, go from 0 to 1 with comms?
Yeah. We had one of our investors, who is just very attuned to comms and PR and has worked in government and worked on comms and PR, a guy called Ian Hogarth, who works for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, amongst other things. And he gave us some pointers on talking points. So that was really the starting point, was just nailing down some core messages. And then we worked with a contractor freelancer who had worked in comms and PR at a startup before. He actually had worked at Airbnb as their head of comms and PR. And I felt like that was a really powerful way to get started because it's a restricted investment. You're not committed long term to a full-time employee, and they can give you advice on the back of their experience. And then he then suggested certain agencies that we could engage and when we should engage them and what we should expect from them. So that was really the journey we went on, and it worked quite well.
That's great. I mean, I feel like, for us anyway, sometimes when we talk to folks that are just starting out, we're kind of reticent to sign up to say, like, oh yeah, well, you need the whole kit caboodle right now, and a consultant is oftentimes a good way to not just gauge how much value you're going to get, but also to understand how much it requires of your time, right? Because that's a big thing, right? Is that, especially when you're early days, a lot of the time of the CEO is spent managing, whoever the comms lead is, whether that's a consultant or an agency. Aman, how about you? What was your kind of first step there?
Yeah, so first had to make the decision to invest in comms. And honestly, for the first 2 years of the company, the decision was not to invest in comms.
Right.
There were other higher priority items we needed to do, like build a product and get our first customers and so on. So it wasn't after the Series A. It was after the Series A that we started to do comms. It was just, we had more resources and more of a story, frankly, as well. And so I work with two investment firms, and Andreessen Horowitz and Obvious Ventures, both of whom are on our board. And they had a list of PR firms, recommended PR firms. And so I got the list from both of them and then picked the agency that was on both lists, which was Inkhouse. So
Love
it was, and so that's we had made the decision to invest in comms and with the cost of an agency.
That's great. How about yourself, Pukar? What was the kind of that first step?
You're muted.
I'm not mute. Well, I've been thinking about sort of like how to better optimize our marketing spend. And this was really, I remember speaking to actually Aman about this, and I think it was like we've been working together for how long? Like 6 months to a year now. And there was that mini like SaaS crash, and a bunch of things got reshuffled, and we wanted to really position ourselves after that for where we can actually again like control our own narrative coming out of that. And I always say if someone smart has figured something out and they put time and money behind it, like Amon had on Inkhouse, then you should probably trust that decision. We did a little bit of due diligence on our own as well, but I think we benefited a little bit from some of the due diligence that Aman had done. But I think it really became a no-brainer decision once I really understood the sort of like the long tail impact that this could have. And we have a tremendous strengths that we want to talk about in the market, and there's not many opportunities to really talk about that, right? You can't
You're
you
right.
can't keep your chest about your like financial position on like a customer call or something like that, but that still ends up mattering, right? Like you can't just like have all these like moments of bravado in every like interaction with the prospects and stuff. So I think having a third party sort of be your wing person, if you will, it's, that's sort of like hyping you up. I think it's a really valuable valuable asset.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. And man, question for you. How if we've worked together for 4 years, and I think you've learned a thing or two about how to empower an agency, right? And get the best work out of them. I think you're one of the masters at that. If someone was embarking on this from day zero or day one, right, and they were hiring an agency, like what advice would you give them to make sure that they're putting their agency in a good position to like drive the most value for them?
Yeah, I mean, first is the agency selection, right? Like, choosing the right we had an agency before Inkhouse and think it wasn't going as well. And so it was actually we needed to make a change as well. And so CEO referrals, which I think is how Picard found you, right? Like it was key. And there was a CEO, former CEO of Hired.com, who's one of our early investors, who had highly recommended Inkhouse. So working with an agency that knows how to work with startups, because we're sort of this unique group of companies, is pretty important. The second thing is know that to get the agency started and to get the comms machine going, it requires CEO time. Right?
Mhm.
It's not really, especially in the beginning, it's not something you can necessarily delegate to others when you're trying to figure out what your story is, how to tell the story, what's going to actually be compelling in the market, what's going to resonate with reporters, all of that requires a lot of strategic thinking and thought, and to get it right the first time around as well. Because those materials and that thought process like lasts you for many, we're still using so many of the same talking points like 4 years later. Right?
Mhm.
So that's the second piece. Be involved as a CEO. The third is just learn as much as you can from the comms experts you're working with. Right? There's many key things I learned from the in-house team. Right? Like number one, no one really cares what your story is. Find a way to get your story to matter in terms of what the overall trends are that are being covered by the media at the time. For example, was like a key learning. Like you can't just say, "Hey, this is what we do," and we're great, right? Like there's a lot more to it than that.
Mhm.
And so, especially for me, I was a total newbie when it came to comms. Like just learning from the comms experts and what's worked and what strategy is the most appropriate is great. And then finally is like that's the strategic component of comms, but there's also like a very big like logistical administrative component to it as well.
Mhm.
And just be ready for either you as a CEO to put the time in if you don't have others, and to delegate that piece as well, because there is a lot of work that goes into putting together launches and engaging with the media and being prepared and all of it, and the assets that are needed and so on. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So just like be ready to invest your time on the non-strategic aspects as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Richard, how about you? If you were advising someone who's just starting out hiring an agency, some of the things you've learned on ways to make that engagement the most successful.
Yeah, I think first off, that was an amazing answer from Mark. It covered a lot of what I would have said there and some stuff I didn't appreciate. I would say one is just knowing your audience, because although agencies are experts in helping craft a narrative and helping get coverage for that narrative, you have to be the expert in your audience. And if you don't bring that to the conversation, then I think you'll have a less effective arrangement. And so you've really got to be able to say in concrete terms, who are your buyers? Who are your users? What do they do? Where do they go? What phrases do they like? And what do they read or look at? Because if you can't do that, I think it is more challenging to get the most out of an agency engagement. And then, yeah, everything else I would say just recapitulates what was sort of, or what has already been said. In particular, that I do think having the founders deeply involved makes a big difference, because when you're still crafting the narratives, whoever's involved needs permission to make adjustments and to act and think on their feet and to change direction if necessary. And really, that's typically the preserve of the founders.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Richard. That's awesome. Yeah. And no surprise, a man had a great answer for that one. Another question kind of related, but a bit different, which is like, if you were to start over yourself, like were there any kind of big mistakes you made or misconceptions you had around comms that you would advise on for founders, right? Like something where you're like, I thought this was going to be easy, it wasn't, or I kind of like, I mean, man, you kind of said it with like, oh, we have a story, everyone should just care about it, right? And it's like, well, you have to massage it into what, a reporter actually is writing about. Are there other examples of things like that? Like lessons learned that do you think like earlier CEOs should know? Picard, maybe I'll start with you for that.
Um, well, I think you have to be come with the mindset that that you're gonna put some work into it. You can't expect to push this comms button or all right, we've hired this PR agency and they're just going to do everything. Um, um, I think it requires it requires a lot of like thought alignment with your team. And um, but it's gonna be effective, right? It's gonna be a really powerful and effective tool. But I think being prepared to be committed um, is and setting aside the hours to like write the blogs or to push the articles and to connect with the right set of folks and show up. Um, that I think is important. But I think what's great about working with Inkhouse is just how how effective you guys are at project managing us and continuing to like drive and follow up and make sure that we're executing on the things that we need to, right? So it does require that sort of like I'm somebody that like I don't, I call myself like a chess piece on the board. So like just tell me what you need me to be and I'll go.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like you guys are really great at sort of like figuring out where to put us, but you have to be prepared to be willing to go and to be willing to do the work and having the team to back you up. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, we always kind of feel like, of course, it's a partnership, but at the end of the day, like it's on us to make it successful, you know? But you bring up a good point, Pukar, which is like, which I didn't have this question written down, but maybe we'll just dive in is like, have there been where do you figure like you step in and say, actually, I disagree, right? Like, I think we should do this, or where do you tend to defer and say, okay, in-house, you guys are the experts, right? Like what areas do you think you've had to like maybe push back on an agency, or well, in-house, frankly, but like, or versus where do you kind of say, okay, I don't know if I totally get it, but I'll do it because, you guys are the experts.
Yeah, I would say the the thing that I don't want to compromise on is like I really treat our story and our narrative and we have a very unique narrative as like a company, right? We've got this sort of like dual presence. We're trying to build we have an office in Kathmandu. We have stuff going on over here. We're trying to like champion Silicon Peaks, like Silicon Valley, Silicon Peaks, like with all the talent along the foothills of the Himalayas. Like I'm very passionate about that. I treat that story as our product,
Mm-hmm.
and I think where I push back is where I feel like that product isn't necessarily being, polished or that story isn't being told in
Mm-hmm.
necessarily the right way, or we're not being positioned correctly for where I think the market is going to go. But I'm not an expert on how we're going to get, attention from a particular publication or how we need to like craft a certain message to be headlined at a conference or get attention from some type of some media outlets. That's not where like I'm an expert on, and I'm glad I don't have to be. But I think you have to determine like what are the things you don't want to compromise on, and that ultimately also does depend on like what is it that you want to what sort of how do you want to be perceived, and what is the type of company you want to build, right?
Right.
For for me personally, like I want to build this company for like 30 to 40 years. Like I want to build like $100 billion company, right? Like that's a long journey that we're on. And it does. I think one thing that's important for all the sort of like early stage founders to think about is to have those conversations with yourself about the type of company that you want to build, because it's going to inform a lot of like
Mm-hmm.
how what sort of like comms strategy you end up taking. I don't think there's anything wrong for like trying to go for like a quick exit or anything like that, but having that intellectual honesty will help you inform of like the types of comp strategy you're trying to deploy. Yeah.
It's so true though, because like what you're saying is there are going to be ideas where your PR team is going to be like, we don't know really about that one. You know what I mean? And you're going to say, yeah, but it's important, right? So like, let's talk more about how to get it out there, And with, okay, like, okay, sounds good. Like, here's some challenges we see with it, but we can figure it out. But if you don't have that sort of, you know, level of like passion around it, then like it's important for the PR team to go, okay, this is really important, right? And so we're going to figure out a way to get that message out there. So I really appreciate that, Pukar. Richard, what about you? Thoughts on that? Like places where you've had to maybe push back a little bit versus where you kind of defer to the agency?
Yeah, I think for me, the places where I find I sometimes have to push back, and I think it's a healthy tension, is that I don't want all press, and we don't want to be commenting on every story about AI, and it's impossible for your agency to know what the true scope or surface area of acceptable topics is. So, generally speaking, if people want to talk about AI safety and the existential threat of AI tools, I don't have a lot to contribute to that. I think it's mostly nonsense. I think it's mostly nonsense, and we're just a humble applied AI company trying to do something in the legal space. So we try to avoid that subject. And personally, I'm not a huge fan of all the exposure that comes from doing all this PR. I do it because I know it is my job, but I don't love it. I know some people love doing it. I'm not one of them. So there are times when, if I don't think it's really going to make an impact, I will make a judgment about whether it justifies the investment of time and resource, at least from me. So I think that's another piece where it's important for me to lay out my boundaries. And again, it's right, it's a healthy tension because you guys should
Yeah.
put us forward for opportunities, even if you think it's speculative or because you can't read our mind. So I think that's an area where we do have a discussion. I would say, though, broadly speaking, I definitely defer to the expertise of our advisors, in particular on the placement of stories, so who we should pitch and why. I kind of trust you guys to know the audience of the outlets and to know what will get the interest of the journalists, and also how we should deal with them. So how candid we should be, how open we should be, how we should prepare to speak to a particular person. I
Yeah.
tend to get these really helpful briefing packs that give me a sense of what to expect. And I personally don't like talking to journalists. They're quite scary people, and I'm generally quite honest, and that's a bad trait apparently when you talk to journalists. So I try and read these packs so I know what's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. All right, new question. And I wanted to shoot this one to Iman, because I know you do it better than most. How do you go about leveraging your investors when it comes to like communications, whether, for introductions to press or, for speaking on your behalf? How do you think about that?
So I generally have a philosophy that investors work for us, not the other way around, right? At the end of the day, they invested in the company, they own a chunk of the company, and so they're in the boat with us to help us be successful. So for comms in particular, I've used I've worked with our investors in a few different ways. One is that they have their own reporter relationships, right? So especially in the beginning when you're getting the comms, just when you're getting started and you don't have any reporter relationships. Um, Sometimes I have had investors do intros to reporters that they're already, familiar with. Some of them they were actually friends with, right? And not, even outside of a professional setting. So that was really helpful. Anytime we have a launch, the launch materials, whether it's like the social media posts or whatever it is, we do a launch every single quarter. Just we have this sort of cadence and belief that, and it's literally a company goal. Like something has to launch every single quarter. It doesn't even, I don't care what it is, right? It could be a data report, a product launch, like whatever. Something has to be announced every quarter, just so we just keep up the momentum and are always in the news. And so every time we have a launch, those links and so on are shared with our investors. Our investors like Andreessen Horowitz and others, like they have their own audiences, they have their own outlets too, right? And so when they're posting and sharing about us, like that is a business and tech audience that we need to also get in front of, especially when it comes to hiring for our companies. So those are probably the two main ways. Occasionally, like work with them on strategy, like hey, ideas for future launches and things like that. But it's mostly the first two, reporter relationships and help us get the word out as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have two last questions, and then I want to see what the audience might have to ask. The first one, and I think whoever feels like answering, I'll stop directing it and just see. Is Elon Musk has made this idea of just not engaging with press and going direct kind of mainstream. I have my own opinion, which is that if you reach the level of Elon Musk, maybe you can get away with that, right? But how do you think about that in terms of like places you might say, I don't really want to get this out via press. I want to get this out, on our website or our blog or our social versus I think we need press in order to get more awareness around what we're doing. How do you see that balance, especially as a founder, who you've all reached some notoriety, right? But started out like fairly unknown, right? And built that up from the ground up. So how do you think about that? And if anybody feels like answering first, I'd welcome that.
I'm happy to go first. I think about this in terms of our audience, really. At the end of the day, we need hospitals and health systems to know about Incredible Health. We need nurses and other healthcare workers to know about Incredible Health. Those audiences are not on Twitter. Like they just, you know what I mean? It's just like they're getting their information and their resources still from very relatively, quote unquote traditional media,
Mhm.
especially the hospitals and health system leaders, right? They have their own trade journals, like Becker's Hospital Review, and then they're reading CNBC and Bloomberg and all the business news as well.
Right.
So that's on the hospital side. And then for the nurse side, I mean, they've got their own set of blog writers and influencers and so on that we engage with, right? So the idea of us not using those channels is not appropriate for our audience. Like
Yep.
I believe a company has to do both. I mean, of course, we still have our own channels too, which also get the messaging pushed through because we have to share directly with our customers and so on, and post on our own LinkedIn's and etc. But that's we need traditional media too.
Mhm.
Yeah, I definitely think tacking on to what Iman said. Oops, I'm getting pinged right now. Uh, I I think there is a difference between like B2B and B2C, right? Like I think, there's certain things that Elon Musk says because he's got a consumer customer base and, any bit of drama, I think is going to be a net win for him anyways. It's more eyeballs on everything he's doing, and I would say he's more maybe even like an exception in some cases that proves the rule. If you've ever sort of like heard of that concept, but I don't think Satya Nadella is out there, it's just sort of like tweeting off. And I think it's worth sort of like inspecting, again, like work backwards from like the outcomes that you want, right? So there's a sort of like long-term vision for Security Pal. There's the sort of like short-term goals we're trying to get to over the course of like the next year or two, and um, from those outcomes. If you think about this from like a first principle standpoint, like from those outcomes, then we want to like win the hearts and minds of, in our case, like CISOs, right? Chief Information Security Officers, like GRC leaders, governance, risk, and compliance, generally more like risk averse people. So like if we were out there with a Muskian personality, I don't know how that would really sit with our customer base. So I think like thinking first principles from the outcome that you're trying to drive to, either in the certainly in the long run, but perhaps even more so in the short run, and then again like who's the audience you're trying to go after, I think matters a lot, and I do think there's a big difference between B2C founders and strategies around comms versus B2B. I mean, like right now, like OpenAI is probably the most infamous company for triggering a lot of like comms conversations. I'm sure
Mhm.
Dan in your WhatsApps and signals or whatever. But you never know. Like everything might just be a net win for them because they end up being the top story, and they're trying to win like a lot of consumer usage, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, you make a really good point, Pukar, which is like, what's the goal, right? And if you're, selling to a B2B audience, especially one that, like you said, is risk averse and, doesn't want to consider anybody at a company as like unstable or aggressive, then, any attention might actually be a negative. All right, last question, hopefully kind of a fun one, which is what do you all read to get your news? Richard, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm both a lawyer and a nerd, so I basically read everything. I mean, my primary sources today, I read the Financial Times, I read Axios, I read a lot of TechCrunch just to see about fundraising announcements. I get a lot of content online. Most of the best news on AI is on X, to be honest. It's from other operators
Hmm.
or other companies releasing papers or releasing threads about work they're doing. So I read a lot of X threads at the minute and lots of podcasts in technology and AI because I just find they're slightly ahead, generally speaking, in the AI circles.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say, but don't be surprised if I've read whatever article you're sending me, generally speaking.
Love it. Hey man, how about you?
In general, like I love using Twitter as a kid. Not I don't like posting that much. I mean, I have to post sometimes for work, right? But I consume a lot of information through that, right? So not just from tech Twitter, but there's also like med Twitter, and you know, there's all these different communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there's it's the articles that are shared through that channel that I'm mostly consuming. Um, and then after that, it's more long form, either long form like investigative articles or podcasts or things like that, where I'm consuming information in more depth.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to just like mention you'd asked earlier, like I was thinking about it, the like lessons learned, like what went wrong and stuff. For me, probably my biggest lesson learned in comms is patience. Like be patient. Like, when and founders in general, if we have to generalize and archetype us, we're an impatient group. We want things done faster, quicker, etc.
PR
And
people are impatient too, by the way. Like that, I think is an actual skill set to be good at PR. So,
exactly. So you can't like necessarily your brand new company, you start you're 3 months into your a real PR effort and you're like upset that you're not on, the front cover of the Wall Street Journal. Okay. Like that's just not how it works. And so it actually takes like a long time, like multiple years to be able to be placed consistently and to build up those relationships. And we've also had like launches that were huge hits that got enormous amount of press, and then we've also had ones that were not as good, right? So for me, it's just I've just learned to be patient, and it's something that you keep gaining momentum the longer you do it.
yep. Yeah, we try to emphasize like look at the trend line, right? Like over 2 weeks, sure, things have dropped, but over 6 months, it's a steady, it should be a steady line up, right? You need a little bit of time to really evaluate how things are going. But we appreciate that point of view for sure. All right. Well, Pukar, what do you read?
Yeah, I think yeah, like I definitely read a lot of Twitter. I think it's less about like the publication now, right? It's more about individual articles,
Mm-hmm.
interaction in the sort of like communities that you follow. So my sort of like vectors for information are um, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever's gaining traction there that I find interesting. And then of course, like, these sort of text groups and that we might have with like fellow investors or other founders, as well as I think I've been finding a lot of value in just sort of like getting like reports forwarded by like investors that only they have access to, or like founders that only they have access to, about like today I just got one about, a VC firm that did a benchmark analysis across all their companies, and just where they're like how is like the top quartile performing versus, and like those type of things are always like insider knowledge that ends up being really valuable. And I'm personally just like a massive fan of Stratechery, Ben Thompson. I like I didn't get an MBA, but like I think consuming his information, and I listen to the podcast and all the content and the sort of like adjacent links that he usually references. I don't have time to read like every article, but he sort of does a readout of his articles as well. So um, one thing I've noticed about founders is like we're like information like guzzlers, right? Like we just want like all the information, all the truth, because we're always looking for like truth, right? Like, okay, what am I missing out on? Like, how can each minute of our time, we want to see how it could be like an edge for our business. So, you know, there's usually like a podcast playing constantly, no matter what I'm doing, whether like housework or like, you know, anything boring, there's always a podcast playing. Or if I'm not on a call, I'm usually scrolling through like Twitter threads that I might have missed or stuff like that. It's just constant
Yeah.
uh, information flow. Yeah.
Well, and you're probably looking for like, all right, the last three things I read all mention the same thing, so that must be super true, right? Like, you start to notice what becomes, more commonly said. So no, I really appreciate that. Okay, well, those are all the planned questions. I see one question that's come in, so we'll dive into that. And folks, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. The question is, can you think of an anecdote when a communications result had a powerful impact on the company that surprised you? So maybe time where PR had a bigger impact on your business than you might have expected. And anyone in particular can jump in.
I'm always just like amazed by the amount of attention financing and fundraising announcements get. Unjustifiably so. Like I think it's frustrating actually that fundraising announcements get more media attention sometimes than important product launches, important data reports, etc. And so that always I've done done what two or three now financing. So like that
Mhm.
it always shocks me how much attention it gets
Yeah.
in a good way. Now
Right. No, but yeah,
all net positive.
yeah, it feels like the same thing over and over, but then it is still what people care about. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, all right. So another question, spicy one potentially. What do you think is a red flag from past comms people / PR agencies? So what would be, if you're evaluating something, what would be a red flag for you? Like something you've learned the hard way in terms of evaluating a team or a person to handle comms.
I can definitely jump in on this one. I think a major red flag is the team that pitches being different to the team that does the work.
Mhm.
And the team that does the work is very, very a junior set of people, and the people who do the pitches are this team of Avengers who look amazing and convince you that they're going to change your life. Because at the end of the day, the people doing the work are the ones that matter, not the ones pitching. And
Yep.
with the greatest respect, I think it's hard for an agency to succeed on the back of its brand or name alone. In the end, the core day-to-day work, the blocking and tackling, whether it's strategic narrative setting or just contacting press, you need to validate that. And so if somebody sends out an amazing team to pitch you, and when you ask, so who's going to be on my account, none of those names are present, run a million miles.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's the ultimate desperation move, in my opinion. Pukar, Mon, any other thoughts or additions there?
I always think sort of like responsiveness. As a startup, you're like you have to find again firms that are used to working with startups, and so if they're not super responsive to you, if they're not like engaging with you, they have other clients that they bill a lot of more, they
Mhm.
bill more to, and like it's rational for them to prioritize those other customers of theirs. So try to find the sort of firm that's stage appropriate as well. I think it's important to really consider that. Yeah.
That's great.
I have a whole set of red flags. I mean, like
How
bad
many of them
project.
are about me, man?
Yeah, none about Inkhouse. Like I mentioned, I've used I've had other experiences, right? Like bad project management is
Mhm.
that one, and that speaks to the speed and responsiveness that Picard is mentioning. Um, there's also a situation a little bit like what Richard was saying, where like there's one awesome, like amazing, highly strategic leader, and then everyone else is nowhere near as good, right?
Mhm.
And that you have to kind of evaluate the whole team and make sure that there's multiple people who can handle strategy. Just so otherwise it's just really tough to make it work.
Yep. All right, we got another question here. How do you think about measuring impact or ROI? And that might be, like either from like maybe more of like a metric specific number or a broader, more like here's our broad objective and what we want to accomplish from comms. How do you all think about that?
I'm happy
can-
to start. Like I report on that even to our board, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's some actual metrics, like what are the media placements, the reach, and so on. But then there's also, so those are the quantitative things, but then there's also some qualitative sort of signs that you start to pick up on, right? So probably 2 years into our relationship with Inkhouse, once we started joining calls with health system leaders, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Incredible Health." That's when you're like, "Okay, like finally, 2 years of
Mm-hmm.
effort is like starting to pay off, right?" And so that that people when you hear it from your community and you're from your network and so on, like, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Incredible Health. I've heard of Incredible Health." You hear it from your customer base, other tech employees, other tech leaders, etc. Um, that's when you know, like, hey, it's actually having an impact.
Mm-hmm.
And then also applicants, when people start applying to
Mm-hmm.
the company, who you've, they and that's because they read about you.
Mm-hmm.
That piece, once that starts happening, that there's some impact.
Go
Yeah,
ahead, Richard.
that's very similar. So we, on the go-to-market side, when we get inbound, we ask, how did you hear about us? And we track how much of that comes from press. Um, we track organic searches for Robin AI because that's brand.
Mm-hmm.
And so we attribute that to comms and PR efforts, essentially. And then same with candidates. We ask them, how did you hear about us or this opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and often they'll reference the press. And so we try and measure it quite concretely, quite qualitatively. But I agree with Iman that there's also just customers messaging you and saying, hey, I saw you in this piece, or people
Yep.
saying, I've heard of you guys. That tells you that it's working.
Yeah, we love the metrics and we love having those systems, but once to that point, people just start talking about, oh, we can't stop hearing about you. Like that's when it's like all the metrics are important, but that's when you're like, okay, something is going quite well here, Well, I think that's about it in terms of time. Iman, Pukar, Richard, anything else you want to add? Any thoughts before we wrap up? I really appreciate everyone's time.
Just good luck.
Yeah. Well, I'll if anyone watching has further questions, you can send them my way, dan@inkhouse.com. And I talk to these folks quite regularly, so I'm happy to figure that out. But thank you so much. You are some of the busiest people I know. So to spend an hour with us is a real gift. So thank you all for the time. Really, really appreciate it.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
Cheers,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.
Bye.
Bye.